So this is lesson number 3 on the history of Afghanistan. So just to remind people, why are we talking about the history of Afghanistan in a Sunday school lesson? It's a legitimate question. But I think really the main reason is we want to understand the times that we live in. And if you look at the news at all, you're going to see stuff about Afghanistan. So we want to, as Christians, we want to understand and have answers to the questions that our leaders are all trying to figure out. Yeah.
I was just say, I remember when the U.S. first went to Afghanistan. I was like, Afghan what? I mean, who, where, what? It just sounded like this place far away. And then I began to read about it. I was like, oh my word, there's a long history here.
Yep.
This country, for some reason, has this long history of dealing with the West.
Yep.
Why?
Yep. Most major Western powers have had some history there. And then the other reason is it's not a Christian place right now, and someday it's going to have to be. So, you know, as an American or a Westerner walking in there, you better understand what the history is, because they haven't forgotten. We're going to talk about the British today a lot, and you can count on it, they haven't forgotten what happened. And so we need to remember that as well. Just as if you're going to be a missionary there, you better know. So today we're going to talk about the Mohamadzai Dynasty and British foreign policy. Basically, the First and Second Anglo-Afghan Wars is going to be the main thing we're going to talk about. The Mohamadzai Dynasty, beginning with Dost Muhammad Khan, which we're going to talk about more in a minute. He came after kind of picking up the pieces of the Durrani dynasty that we talked about last time. The founder of that dynasty was Ahmad Shah Durrani, and mid-1700s he came to power, took over from the Persians, and was the first guy to set up kind of a modern country of Afghanistan. But really he was just a super chieftain, you might say. It was a loose coalition of tribes that he held together by force. And that's really the situation. That's kind of the situation where we're picking up right here. We've got a lot of very loosely connected tribes with a rather weak guy in charge who's mainly only in charge because he has a big army. So just to remind ourselves here, Afghanistan's right here. So this is including Pakistan and India. That's all British India. During today's time period. And then we got Russia, and most of this area here in Central Asia at this point in time is controlled by Russia. So the time period we're talking about is often called the Great Game in history books, and it's the Great Game between Britain and Russia. And that was a global game trade war that was going on, but that's one of the motivating factors behind the British in their decisions. And in a very real sense, Afghanistan was caught in the middle of that. This is the geography again. The Hindu Kush Mountains going down the center, with the Amu Darya River on the northern border, and the Indus River down in the eastern portion. That are some of the main geographical features. And then here's the major cities we're going to talk about: Kabul, Kandahar, Herat, and Mazar-e-Sharif. Those have always been basically the 4 main cities in Afghanistan. So anyway, we left off that last time with Dost Muhammad Khan. I note here he's a Barakzai in the way this works. Again, the Durranis were part of the Sadozai family. Dost Muhammad is their arch enemy from their arch enemy, the Barakzais. That's just how things work. Your loyalties are family-based in Afghanistan. And you can see how this works. His name is Dost Muhammad. He's the founder of the Mohamadzai Dynasty. So they come from Muhammad. So you can see he was ruler from 1826 to 39, and then again from 1845 to 63. And that is because in the middle there is the First Anglo-Afghan War, and where the British deposed him. Last time we left off with the history leading up to that, and this Tripartite Treaty, which was the treaty that the British made when they went in. So if you'll remember, the main thing, this is the East India Company right now, is the British force in India. Business is, they're all about business. So one of the things that Dost Muhammad was doing wrong was getting into conflicts with the Sikh nation, which was in northern India. And they're on either side of the Khyber Pass right now, and the Afghans said that certain regions that the Sikhs had taken from them were still theirs, so they were always fighting, made business difficult through the Khyber Pass. Then also, Dost Muhammad was very weak militarily, and he was always trying to get, basically he was going to be friends with whoever gave him the most guns and the most money. And so what he ended up trying to do was to play the British off of the Russians to make the British worried enough that they would give him more money. What happened was the British just decided, we can do without you. We don't need to, you know. So this guy, Shuja Shah, had been a previous Emir. Emir is what they call the king. Emir of Afghanistan. He had been kicked out. He was a Durrani. So he comes from the traditional line. He had been kicked out by one of his cousins, fled to India, where the East India Company put him on their payroll and just kept him around in case they'd ever need him. When they started getting into trouble with Dost Muhammad, they said, hey, we've got this guy, Shuja. He's actually from the traditional family line that's been ruling Afghanistan. He's a Durrani. You know, this should work out. We'll just he's been friendly to us. We'll put him on the throne. Everything will be good. So they came up with this treaty between Shuja, the Sikhs, and the British. Basically, Shuja, in return for getting put back on the throne, he agreed to relinquish all claims to any land beyond the Khyber Pass. That's the pass between Kabul and what's modern-day Pakistan. So all those lands that the Sikhs had taken, he agreed to give up, and that basically the idea was that would solve the Anglo or the Afghan-Sikh conflict. So that would make some peace there. And then also he agreed to give British control of his foreign policy, and that would create a British-friendly buffer state between the Russians and India. So in return, the British promised to stay out of Shuja's domestic affairs and protect him against foreign incursions. So you can see that this, if this works, this is going to be really good for Britain. This is exactly what they've always wanted. So that brings us to the First Anglo-Afghan War in 1839 to 42. The British sent two armies into Afghanistan, one through the Khyber Pass, which is by Kabul, and the other through the south, through the Kajaki Pass, it's called, which is by Kandahar. And to basically the idea being to depose Dost Muhammad and put in Shuja. So the East India Company sent these two expeditionary forces. The southern force, that was the main force, they entered through the Kajaki Pass and secured Kandahar actually without a fight. It turned out the guys who were in charge of Kandahar didn't like Dost Muhammad, so they just switched sides. Now it turned out later they didn't really like Shuja either, but they really didn't like Dost Muhammad, so worked out. Then they moved north and they captured the fortress of Ghazni, and they actually captured it in just 2 days. Dost Muhammad was relying on them getting tied up in a long siege there. So this is actually a picture from that conflict. So you can see that's the fortress of Ghazni. The British engineers were able to put gunpowder underneath the gate and just blew it up, and then they stormed it. And it ended up being a rather bit of a disappointment for Dost Muhammad. So similar, the smaller northern force, so they came through the Khyber Pass, and they were able to clear that, but they also were able, through paying off some tribes, to raise a revolt north of Kabul at the same time. And so those northern tribes then attacked from the north, and so it created a three-pronged attack on Kabul, and they all converged, and Dost Muhammad didn't stand a chance. He realized that he couldn't win a pitched battle, so he left, fled north of the Hindu Kush up to the Mazar-e-Sharif area to try to raise a resistance up there. So far, things have been going pretty well with a few minor glitches. The British pretty much just rolled over all resistance. That's when, as soon as the fighting stopped, that's kind of when things started to fall apart. So it turned out that Shuja's supposed popularity was a myth. He actually didn't have, nobody really liked him. That was the reason he got kicked out in the first place. So that was a disappointment. Then he proceeded to alienate the northern tribes by not rewarding them for their rebellion in his favor. And instead, he appointed his inner circle from India to all the key cabinet positions. So, big diplomatic mistake. So they all went home mad, and they were some of the main guys that revolted later. Then Shuja also went on to made a bunch of tax mistakes. He violated long-standing tax exemption agreements between some of them going all the way back to Ahmad Shah, the first of the Duranis. He even tried to tax religious possessions in violation of Sharia law. Then when he didn't have the power to collect, then he lost face. It was a terrible, terrible situation. But then he didn't have much money either. So he was unable to put together a good army. Now the whole idea was that as soon as they put Shuja in power, he would make his own army and then they would leave, right? Well, it turned out he couldn't put together an effective force, partly because he didn't have money and partly because his troops always defected as soon as they got into battle. So, yeah, just they didn't have much of a personal loyalty for him. So that on Shuja's side, there's a lot more mistakes, but that was some of them. The British then started making their own mistakes. So when they first set up camp near Kabul, because they had to stay to prop him up, instead of occupying the Bala Hissar, which is the main fortress in Kabul, they built their cantonment in open country overlooked by a large hill. It was a great peacetime location, but it was a terrible defensive position because what happened later was the enemy snipers were able to shoot down from the hill right into their camp. But the whole thing was they thought they had won and it wasn't going to be a big deal. They should have taken possession of the Bala Hissar, but Shuja naturally didn't want them there because that would make him look like he was being propped up by the infidels. So that wasn't good for him. So they decided not to do that. Okay. Then second blunder was they stored their munitions and food supplies outside the compound. So the cantonment is kind of like a fortified camp. So they didn't have a good place inside, so they stored them a few hundred yards away, and that was a big part of the problem later on. When Shuja proved incompetent, the British increasingly told him what to do, thus strengthening resistance by confirming the claims by his enemies that the country was being ruled by infidels. So the British started supplying a lot of his money, and as a result, they wanted some say in what happened. Even though the original treaty had been that the British were going to stay out of the internal affairs, that's pretty hard to do when you're the one paying for somebody. Anyway, then the occupation got really expensive, so the higher-ups in the East India Company ordered more troops to be pulled out sooner than was militarily advisable because they still needed them there, but they pulled them out anyway. And they also cut payments to some mountain tribes that were contracted to keep the supply routes open. So they just said, okay, we're not paying you anymore. And these are guys that traditionally, whoever wants to go through these passes, you have to pay the tribes that are there so that they don't attack you. So the British just stopped paying them. So pretty soon their supply routes were cut off as a result of that. Then we still got this problem of Shuja's army. So the British decided to take over and restructure it according to their own idea of a merit system rather than the traditional feudal system. So traditionally, you get to be a military officer by being in the right family. So they said, no, we're going to scrap that. We're going to build a merit system here where you get to be officer by knowing what you're doing. So in doing so, he alienated the whole army because that's just not how things were done. And then the British turned a blind eye to officers who consorted with Afghan women. Depending on who you read, depends on how big of a problem this actually was. But some people think that it was a really big problem and that there was a lot of it going on. And if you remember, part of the honor code of the Afghan man is protecting the chastity of your women. And so for the British to be consorting with their women was a huge affront. So did not build good relations. So those are just a sampling of some of the mistakes that were going on. I also want to give one example of just the total dysfunction between Shuja and the British. So one of the things was Kabul at this time was a very small city by Western standards. Only the British force doubled the size of the population. So you can imagine that's going to create a food shortage. So the price of bread skyrocketed. Well, the shopkeepers soon realized this is a good opportunity, so they actually started reducing their production to drive the price even higher. And the British didn't really realize what was going on, so they started buying bread and giving it out for free, and that just made the problem even worse, because they kept the demand up. So finally, Shuja put a price cap on bread and said they weren't allowed to sell it for more than what the local people could afford. Well, the shopkeepers responded by basically going on strike and said, we're not going to bake any more bread then. So then Shuja sent his police guys out and made them make bread at gunpoint. So then the shopkeepers were not happy, so they went to the British and said, hey, we're being oppressed, this is terrible. And the British, instead of siding with Shuja, which would have been the smart political thing to do, they sided with the shopkeepers and made Shuja take back his decree. So at the end of the day, Shuja lost a lot of face, and the common people didn't like the British anymore because the price of bread went up again. So nobody benefited except the shopkeepers. So there's all kinds of stuff like that was going on. It was total dysfunction. And eventually that came to a head in the fall of 1841, and the tribes a lot of the northern tribes that had already been made mad by Shuja, along with a lot of other tribes, just went into open revolt. So Akbar is Dost Mohammed's son. He led the revolt. And basically the British soon lost their supplies that were stored outside their camp. They were cut off from the Bala Hissar, so Shuja's forces and the British were separated by the revolt in between in the city, so they couldn't communicate or get back and forth. And the British soon started starving because they'd lost all their supplies, and no one would sell them anything. So it created a very desperate situation very fast, especially since it's the middle of winter. So finally, they negotiated an agreement with Akbar for safe conduct out. So the agreement was, we're going to leave, just give us safe conduct. And they really didn't have any option at that point. They had to go. So in the dead of winter, I think it was the middle of January, there's about 4,500 troops and about 11,000 camp followers set out for Jalalabad, which is about halfway through the Khyber Pass. Then those mountain tribes that had been not paid, of course they were not happy, so they attacked as they were headed through, and reportedly Akbar himself went along to watch and didn't have any. Basically, his guarantee of safe passage did not mean anything. He didn't do anything about it. Not that he really could have, because he didn't control those tribes, but reportedly he was all on board with it. Anyway, only 63 people survived, and 62 of those were either officers or officers' wives who were held hostage then for ransom. Only one guy made it to Jalalabad. It's thought that they let him go just so someone could tell what happened. Yeah, there's a famous painting of him arriving, and there's a myth that he was the only survivor. There's a myth but there's actually a number of others that were rescued later or bought back later, basically. But yeah, that is one of the myths of the first Anglo-Afghan War, that there was only one survivor. In any case, about 15,000 people died. There's some accounts, because of those survivors, there's some accounts of how, and it's just horrible. You know, if you didn't get shot, you froze to death, basically, because it was in the middle of winter. So, well, you can imagine the British were not happy about that. So then they sent what's now called the Army of Retribution. And so as soon as things thawed out, they went in and basically killed anybody that they thought was involved in it, and burned some a good part of Kabul, and just kind of, in general, made retributions for the whole thing, and then pulled out. And that brings us to the second reign of Dost Muhammad. He came back to power, of course, and that was the that was the end of the first Anglo-Afghan War. Now, people debate over whether it was actually whether or not it was a diplomatic success or defeat for the British. In his second reign, Dost Muhammad became markedly more friendly to the British. As you can imagine, he realized they're serious about this. It's time to be friendly. So he actually ended up signing 2 Anglo-Afghan treaties, creating agreements that were virtually identical to the ones that Shuja had signed. So the British did end up getting what they wanted, but not with the guy that they wanted. So in a sense, it was a diplomatic success, though if you take into account the vast amounts of money that they spent, there surely would have been a diplomatic way to use half of that money even to get what they wanted with Dost Muhammad in the first place. So anyway, that's what happened. The British then even started giving him large amounts of guns and cash. So he started being more friendly. They said, okay, this works. What we really want is a strong buffer state. So they started feeding him a lot of aid, and he was able to recapture his Kandahar, Herat, Mazar-e-Sharif, and really take over what is now called modern Afghanistan with that British aid to a large extent. He died in 1863, just a few days after conquering Herat, finally. That had been one of the main things of his second reign. He's always trying to do that. Finally got it done and died a few days later. One thing to know about Dost Muhammad is that he permanently altered Afghan government by using his own sons to govern cities like Kandahar rather than just forcing the locals to swear allegiance. So this was a huge step towards centralized government in Afghanistan, because before, you're the king with the army, you go through, force them to swear allegiance to you, and then you basically let them govern on their own unless they revolt, and then you go back and punish them. What he did was he installed governors in all those places that were personally loyal to him, which meant that they were part of his family. So it was a family government, but it was centralized. So that was something that changed, and that's how it's been after that, way into the 20th century, that people governed with their families. The British, shortly after the first Anglo-Afghan War, the British had a fallout with the Sikhs, and they annexed all that northern India. So that made Afghanistan even more important as a barrier between Russian-controlled and Persian-controlled areas and India. So it made the British even more motivated to continue to support Dost Muhammad and also to keep somebody friendly there on the throne.
Given this is the era of the game.
Yeah.
The Russians didn't try to take advantage of all this chaos.
It appears that the threat of the Russians was largely perceived in retrospect. In the first Anglo-Afghan War, there had been one of the things that spawned it was there was a diplomatic envoy that came to Kabul, and when the British found out about that, that was one of the things that made them go in, but it turned out that envoy didn't even have authorization from the Tsar, and it seems like it was largely perceived.
Actually, too, given this time frame, Russia was actually very heavily in talks with the United States because this is in the middle of the Civil War.
Oh yeah?
And Russia was very friendly to the U.S. government and was threatening to come in on the side of the U.S. had Britain come in on the side of the Confederacy.
I see.
So they were actually, at one point, they had sailed a large portion of the Russian fleet over outside of New York in a show of support.
I see.
So militarily, Russia's kind of got one foot loose in case they need to put it over into the Western.
It never seemed the British were paranoid that their cash cow, India, would be attacked by the Russians, but it never seems that the Russians were actually wanted to extend themselves that far. It would have actually been very difficult to run a campaign through the mountains of Afghanistan and effectively supply an army in India. It would have been really difficult, especially with the British having control of the sea and being able to bring in supplies that way. Also over this time, I was going to mention the Crimean War in the 50s, in the 1850s, some of what created some paranoia because they were fighting in Crimea. So there's always the chance that the Russians would open up a second front, in Central Asia. Again, it never happened, never materialized. That gets us, so 1863 is the death of Dost Mohammad. Typical Afghan politics, a bloody civil war broke out. Everybody and all the members, all the descendants of Dost Mohammad, his cousins, or even his cousins, his nephews, whatever, all fought each other until finally this guy named Sher Ali Khan, he was son of the Dost. I put that in there because the Dost is what the British called Dost Mohammad in all their correspondence. It's kind of a, I don't know, I guess a demeaning title. They just called him the Dost. Anyway, he finally came out on top, Sher Ali. So Russia, meanwhile, had been coming steadily south in their influence. They were all the way to the Amu Darya at this point. So the British, they were concerned about that, and so there were some attempts to renew the treaties of Dost Mohammad with Sher Ali. The thing was, Britain at this point had decided to be very non-interventionist in Afghan politics. Which what that meant was they did not want to support any faction against any other. So they didn't want to be the one choosing who was on the throne, basically. Which meant they really didn't want to support Sher Ali because he was still in the middle of a lot of civil war. So they refused to give him guns and money, basically. Well, Sher Ali that was what he wanted in return for giving the British control of his foreign policy. So they kind of stalemated, and they couldn't get anywhere because Britain refused to support him. And in return, he refused to cooperate, basically. So that went on until about 1875. And then there was a change in government in London. And Benjamin Disraeli's government got elected. And you probably know his name. He is a very famous English prime minister. Yeah, prime minister. Anyway, his government was all about taking a more aggressive tack in some of the colonial areas. So there was renewed fears about Russia. They said we need to take a forward policy, is what they called it. So basically, what that meant is they said we need to have what they called a residency or an embassy in Kabul. We need to have somebody there to keep an eye on this Sher Ali, because we don't know if he's negotiating with the Russians behind our back. The only way for us to know is if we have somebody there. So, despite the protests of all the senior officials in India, they were all against this. They knew that the British were hated in Afghanistan. There was no way it was going to end well to put actual British people in there. But the Disraeli's government insisted on establishing this residency. So they went into negotiations with Sher Ali. Sher Ali said, I cannot protect. I'm not powerful enough to protect a British person in my country. So he refused. And so they went back and forth. And eventually, diplomacy just completely broke down. The British walked away from the talks. They would not talk to him. Then something really unfortunate happened. At the same time, in early 1878, Sher Ali received a letter informing him that a Russian envoy was on his way to Kabul. So they just informed him, we're coming. So he was very alarmed by this because he knew the British would not be happy about that. So he asked them not to come, but the Russians ignored him and just said, we're coming, and by the way, we're holding you responsible for what happens to them. So if they get hurt, So at this point, he has no contact with the British. He has no support from the British. He realized he cannot afford to give the Russians an excuse to invade. So he had no choice but to let them come. Of course, the British were furious when they heard that he was allowing Russian diplomats in while he had just refused to let British diplomats in. So they were furious. So they immediately sent out an envoy of their own. They just said, hey, we're coming. So Sher Ali seems to have been unable to decide what to do about that. It was a very awkward situation. And for lack of instructions, it seems that the border guard just made a decision on his own and turned them back. So the British then, with their having been turned away, they sent an ultimatum. They said either apologize for turning back our envoy and agree to a permanent residency immediately, or we're going to invade. And they set a deadline of 11/20/1878. Sher Ali appears to have not been able to make up his mind again, and the deadline passed, and British troops marched into Afghanistan. Yes?
I mean, if the British were kind of, they lost the war. So then why do they have any say as to what goes on within the country?
Well,
I guess I missed that part.
you can dispute whether or not they lost the war. They pulled out. The British, in both Anglo-Afghan wars, whipped every Afghan army they went up against very easily. The problem was they couldn't administrate. And so eventually they pulled out and Dost Mohammad took back over. However, they had then gotten their treaties with him that they wanted in the first place and got control of his foreign policy. That's always what they were after, because they wanted to make sure that Afghanistan was a British-friendly state. So they were unable to renew those agreements with Sher Ali, mainly because they wouldn't give him any money. And does that make sense? So
Is Afghanistan supposedly like a British colony?
no, not really. But it was understood to be a British zone, you might say, or a British-influenced region. Yeah.
I mean, this looks like it's just costing a lot. Was trade that lucrative with Afghanistan? I mean, I think of Afghanistan as, I'm not really thinking resource-rich area here.
Well, Afghanistan was never important because it was Afghanistan. It was always about where it was. The main cash cow was India, and the whole point was we need in the British mind, whether true or not, in the British mind it was we have to have a buffer state there so that we don't have Russian armies right at the Khyber Pass. That would be a nightmare. So we need a way to have a buffer, kind of a no-fly zone where if we get word of a Russian army marching in, we can oppose them before they ever get to India. The British viewed Afghanistan as a necessary part of protecting India. Now, during these wars, they were extremely costly, and in the first Anglo-Afghan War, the East India Company went heavily into debt to finance it. It didn't work out for them financially, and I don't think by this time, the second Anglo-Afghan War, it's the British government directly, not the East India Company anymore, but still extremely costly. This is a cartoon, and if you look at the date on this, it's November 30th, so 10 days after the British had declared war. So this is one cartoonist making fun of another newspaper, what another newspaper said. So what the newspaper had said, and this is in Britain, if at the moment it has been decided to invade the Emir's territory, we are acting in pursuance of a policy which in its intention has been uniformly friendly to Afghanistan. Then we've got the Russian bear and the British lion, and here's Sher Ali caught in the middle. And you can see the bear is drooling there, and the lion's got his mouth open. And under here he's got the caption, "Save me from my friends." And it's an astute cartoon of the situation. But I get a kick out of this too. This uniformly friendly to Afghanistan, that is eerily similar to what the United States said when we invaded Afghanistan. We are liberating the Afghan people. We are from the Taliban, etc. Well, regardless of how that was, the Afghan people did not view the British as liberators or as friendly here. They viewed it as an attack. So, anyway, I find this very interesting piece of history.
Not totally relevant to what you're talking about, but just by way, maybe you guys know this, that exact article was used heavily by early dispensationalists
Oh, yeah?
because Russia is the bear.
Okay.
Like legit. That
So
was
you've
a
seen
big
this
argument.
cartoon before?
Yeah, that was a big argument they
Nice.
made about, look how it's always been used throughout history. It's always been understood that Russia's the bear of, of Daniel's when you redo the
That's fascinating.
all the European states.
Quick side note, when they came in to do their punishment or retribution, do you have any idea how many people they would have killed?
I don't think it was on the scale of what,
I don't know.
I don't think it was on the scale of 15,000, but I didn't actually read any numbers. I know they did execute a bunch of people. They whipped a couple armies, so a lot of people died there.
It seems like it was a serious show of force, which
Yeah.
may have made them nervous. If the British want to come in, it seems like they have the ability to.
Yeah, there was never any question that the British had the ability to come back whenever they wanted. Sher Ali in his negotiations, he was caught in a very bad spot because if he appeared to be friendly to the British, he would get deposed by his own people. On the other hand, if he was unfriendly to the British, he might be deposed by the British. So, and by all accounts, he wasn't the greatest diplomat to begin with. So he was just, and then, as we're going to see, Russia didn't come through for him either. So, yeah, it was a bad spot to be, very bad spot. Anyway, the Second Anglo-Afghan War, basically 40 years exactly later, 1878 to 80, Sher Ali's demise. So, the British used basically the same strategy as last time, sent two armies in, one through the south, one through the north, and with the main force coming through the south. It seems like Sher Ali decided that it would be better not to oppose the British in the south, maybe let them overextend their supply lines, and then something like happened the first time around, and the tribes would rise, and maybe something like that. But he basically made his way personally to Russia. So he was hoping to get Russian aid at this point. So he tried to. The Tsar, though, refused to see him. The Tsar was not in a position to start a war with Britain at that point. Not interested. And Sher Ali died a few months later. He was in pretty poor health at that time anyway. His son, Yaqub Khan, went to Kabul to take charge of resistance. But when news of Sher Ali's death came, the army completely collapsed. People basically just went home. And he was left with no choice but to take whatever terms the British would give him, basically. So, that resulted in the Treaty of Gandamak. So, the British congratulated themselves on an easy victory. Yaqub agreed to a permanent British residency in Kabul. He also ceded all control of foreign policy and several key cities and forts. So the British took the chance to do a little land grab. And then the British agreed to pay him an annual subsidy to keep him in power. So the British set up their residency in Kabul and began withdrawing troops. And that was the end of that. Except, again, the diplomatic failure just immediately took over. So the situation began to fall apart. Yaqub had no money and very little loyalty, so he's a brand new ruler. In Afghanistan, it takes time after you become the emir before you crush all the revolts and actually have some power. So he had no money, no ability to tax, very little loyalty. Thus, the British had to pay his bills. So their residency became basically a way of financing Yaqub's government. This in turn made Yaqub look even more like a British puppet and even harder for him to procure taxes or get any loyalty. So just kind of spiraled downward. Meanwhile, so Yaqub has this brother named Ayub. He's governor of Herat. So really unfortunate things happens over there. Sher Ali had a garrison up north near Mazar-e-Sharif, and there was a revolt. They got kicked out, and it turned out that they hadn't been paid for a couple of years, I think. So they marched down to Herat and demanded payment. Well, Ayub didn't have any money either. So he said, go to Kabul and Yaqub will pay you. So they went off and marched off to Kabul. So they show up. They arrive in Kabul penniless, in a very raw temper, you can imagine. And when Yaqub was unable to pay them, they attacked him in the Bala Hissar. But that's a pretty good fortress, so they didn't prevail. So when they couldn't take that, they said, okay, we got this British Residency over here that's got all this cash in it. Let's just go take that. So that's what they did. They attacked the Residency. The accounts of the defense of the Residency, it was not a defensive position at all. It was supposed to be a diplomatic center, not a fort. And but all the accounts of it, the defense was nothing short of miraculous. They held out for most of the day against overwhelming numbers, but in the end, they were slaughtered. And only two sepoys survived to tell that tale. The sepoy is an Indian, ethnically Indian person who fights for the British. So the way most of the British armies in India, and most of the armies that fought in the Afghan wars were actually Indian people. Just with British commanders. So anyway, only 2 sepoys survived. There's a couple hundred, I think, give or take, British that were slaughtered in that mess. So, got the slaughter. Again, a British army immediately marches on Kabul. Very similar affair to what happened last time. General Roberts, who was commander of that, declared martial law and executed anyone suspected of being involved in the massacre. Some of them on some very flimsy evidence. Yaqub was accused of complicity in the whole thing, and so he was exiled to India. So while all this is going on, Ayyub, his brother in Herat, decided to revolt, and he even managed to defeat a small British contingent. I think it was like 2,000 guys or something, at the Battle of Maiwand. And it's one of the only times that an Afghan army beat a British army in open battle. And if you go over to Afghanistan, that way I understand, Maiwand is everywhere. It's a national, it's a celebrated, I think it might even be a holiday. They have a holiday for it. But anyway, they got streets and towns and stuff named it. Anyway, he beat the small force, and then he had the audacity to lay siege to Kandahar. So they have a small British garrison there, and so they're under siege. Now Roberts has to quickly wrap up things in Kabul so he can go down and take care of that mess. So while all this is going on, there's this other guy, a cousin of Ayyub, up in the north, named al-Raman Khan. And he's taken over the Mazar-e-Sharif area, did his own little rebellion. And so they say, okay, this guy seems like he's doing something. Let's bring him down and make him emir. So that's what they do. Then Roberts hastily goes down south, completely defeats Ayyub, and British troops again withdraw. So the important thing about this is the Lyall Agreement, which was the agreement between al-Raman and the British. So basically, very similar agreement. al-Raman agreed to cede all control of his foreign policy to Britain. In return, Britain agreed to pay an annual subsidy and defend him from foreign invasion. Demands of a residency, though, were conspicuously absent. They had figured out it wasn't going to work to put a residency in there. By this time, also, there had been a change of government in London, partly because of the debacle that was going on in Afghanistan. And so there was, the officials in India were instructed to wrap it up. So the interesting thing about this is the terms of this agreement are almost identical to the ones that Sher Ali, the guy they had gone in to depose, had originally wanted in the first place. He wanted guns and money in return for ceding his foreign policy. So the British could have had this same agreement before the war, if they would have been willing to, give Sher Ali guns and money. So, in retrospect, it really seems kind of senseless what happened there, but that's how it was. So that brings us to al-Raman. He did stick. So he's called the Iron Amir, or the Bloody Amir by some people. He ended up being a very, very brutal dictator. He put down 40 major revolts in 20 years. So he ruled from 1880 to 91, fought 40 major wars essentially against his own people. Executed over 100,000 people in addition to those killed in battle. He even created a secret police force that would have made the Soviets proud. They still talk about this police force in the same way we would talk about the KGB or the Gestapo. Like, that's how it's remembered. It was very feared. Just as an example of his brutality, after a Ghilzai revolt, he shipped around 2,000 heads to Kabul and had them piled up in pyramids as a deterrent. And the reason I mention that, it's kind of a disgusting detail, but stuff like that, and if you read the history from 1700 to 1900 in Afghanistan, stuff like that is actually pretty common. It's on almost every page, somebody's getting slaughtered in a very brutal way. That's just the nature of Afghan politics. al-Raman was especially bad, though. His main goal seems to have been, he didn't want to just be like the top dog. He wanted to actually administrate, which nobody had ever actually administrated Afghanistan. Like, you basically, in the way it had been done previously, you basically conquer everybody, and then they give you tribute and more or less do what you tell them to do, but you don't control what's going on in the local population. He wanted to actually do that, and that's why he had 40 major revolts in 20 years. One of his other interesting policies is he forcibly relocated 100,000 to 200,000 Pashtuns north of the Hindu Kush as part of what he called Afghanization. So, his thought was, we're going to mix these people up, cut them off from their roots, they'll be more peaceful. It created more loyalty north of the Hindu Kush, so that the two would be kind of tied together. It was a real debacle, though, because the farming techniques were completely different that you needed for one or the other. A lot of the people died of starvation because they couldn't adapt. Anyway, very, very bad time to be in Afghanistan over this period. But from a British standpoint, this is the last thing I want to talk about. The British considered al-Raman to be basically a necessary evil. They continued to feed him cash and modern weapons throughout his reign. They didn't like the fact that he was, killing people all the time, but at the same time, he was powerful and he didn't correspond with the Russians. So, that was good. And what they did want was a strong buffer state. They fed him a lot of modern weapons. The main weapon in Afghanistan right then was a muzzleloader, and they provided him a lot of breech-loading rifles. And that's a lot of the reason why he was able to put down all those revolts, is just he had superior weaponry. The British used these subsidies, though, as a leverage to secure a formal agreement on Afghanistan's borders for the first time. So before, it had always been zones of control, You know about where the border is, but it's not defined. So with a few minor changes, these are the modern lines. So the guy who negotiated a lot of this was named Mortimer Durand. That's why this line here is called the Durand Line. And this is the modern line between Afghanistan and Pakistan. I'm just going to quickly go around the borders here and explain some things. So here's the line. You can see, they took most of these mountains here. So the whole, Kajaki Pass was in their control. Most of the Khyber Pass up here. There was some, disagreements over this, obviously. So what they did was a bit of clever diplomacy. In return for him ceding areas down here, they gave him this little piece up here. And you may have been wondering, why is there that little panhandle sticking out there that goes all the way over to China? So they gave him that as a bargaining chip, but it also accomplished something that they wanted too, because the British did not want a border with any Russian-controlled territory. And this made a little buffer zone between India and the Russian-controlled areas. And that area is not really worth anything, it's just mountains, but anyway, that's why it's there. It's the legacy of British colonial politics. Then they also negotiated the whole northern border that goes along the Amu Darya. And then this border is very important, down from Herat up to the Amu Darya, because that had always been in dispute between, either the Russians or the Uzbeks and those kind of peoples were always disputing with the Afghan emirs about who controlled those areas. So they drew a hard line, and that's basically where it is today. So that gets us all the way up to the 20th century, and that's where we're going to cut it off today. But any questions or comments? It appears, a lot of the historians that I've read, when you look back at what the British did, it appears, number one, that a lot of the threats with Russia were more perceived than they were actual, though that's not what it looked like to them at the time. They also, in the way that things worked out for them, it looks like they could have got everything they wanted, for a lot less if they had just come to the table with money rather than invaded, like the vast amounts of money they spent on these invasions. However, again, that's not how it looked to them at the time. So, things like, when you read the accounts of their negotiations, things like British pride come into it too, like and also Afghan pride, and the emirs did not like to be looked at as the British puppets, and the British thought that they could just tell the emirs what to do, and any little affront was an offense to British pride, and so there was some of that went into this too. But it's very fascinating history. But just to emphasize again, you can guarantee the Afghans have not forgot about this stuff. So we need we need to remember it too.
Was there? I mean, obviously the Khyber Pass is frequently traveled, but was there a lot of trade that went through there, or was the British trade mostly by ocean?
I think the British trade was mostly by ocean. I think there was still trade between this area coming down through various places. I don't know a lot about that though.
So it was much more important just as a buffer than
I think so.
as keeping a trade route open.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah. I think the trade may have been more important in the first Anglo-Afghan War than it was later on, but oceans definitely took over. Okay, Joel and then Dave, I guess.
Okay, this has been really helpful to me because one of the areas I feel like I'm least competent in, which is really saying something in terms of, how does the world work and what does the Bible say about it. This has really been helpful to me because this has been a study in fighting a war, just have a buffer state. Mm-hmm. And I believe the Bible is really against that. And for example, I use Jehoshaphat, who was in the south, he allies with Ahab, who's in the north, to be a buffer state against Syria, who they're both scared of. Mm-hmm. So Jehoshaphat from the south, does the right thing by realpolitik. He helps Ahab to protect him from Syria. He didn't really like Ahab that much. He should protect him from Syria. And he gets told not to do that kind of stuff by prophet when he comes back. And so, but states do this all the time. The South Africans did it in South Africa, setting up buffer states between them and other hostile states. And the whole Afghan thing now begins to make sense to me. It was a buffer state war. And I think of this, what was supposedly said by Yamamoto, who was the really well-respected Japanese admiral, was talking about invading the United States. No, we're never going to do that. Everybody's got a gun. Which seems to me the way that proper warfare was to be conducted, as I understand it, by the way God set it up. We're going to arm everybody. We're not going to fight these buffer proxy war type stuff. Everybody's going to be scared to invade us. We don't have to invade anyone. We don't have to go set up a buffer state. they're just gonna be scared to invade us. So I think through this study so far, I'm getting a little piece of an idea of proper foreign policy, at least when it comes to setting up buffer states.
Yeah.
And the problems that causes.
Yeah. You got to look back and say, what if they would have spent that money, that same amount of money, you know, on some other defensive project or building up their military in some way? Wouldn't have that been a better expenditure to be more ready to fight a major war with Russia, say, than spending all this money propping up some Amir in Afghanistan, who we think is going to be friendly to us, who, at the end of the day, his military doesn't mean a whole lot, you know?
And they didn't like him anyway. They were
Yeah.
seasoned.
No, they didn't. There was a lot of disdain among the British for the Afghans.
Wasn't that a prime route, though, from China to the Middle East? So, like,
My understanding is that the main routes to China went over top of, because if you come down through Afghanistan and end up in India, you got to go through the Himalayas to get up to China, because this is the main range, the Himalayas here. In the ancient times, there were routes, major routes going to India through there to the Middle East. Those were not as important once sea travel, you know. However, anybody who wanted to trade with Afghanistan had to do it mostly by that way, because the British controlled India. So if you didn't want to go through the British, you had to go that way. But one of the things that's interesting to me today is they're building I think it's supposed to be finished next year, is building a pipeline from Uzbekistan through southern Afghanistan and down into Pakistan to move oil from Uzbekistan and get access to it. And that's going to be a major, you know, geopolitical focal point once that's done, because that's going to be worth a lot of money.
there's a lot of other stuff going on with China right now in building some major highways and some high-speed rails and some railroad lines in that whole vicinity.
Is that right?
I read an article on how China is trying to influence a lot of those countries in Africa and some of those areas to kind of make this network.
Okay.
But that's part of that pipeline that you're talking about.
Okay.
It's not just a pipeline.
Yeah.
And this article was talking about how bad that is for some of these countries who are in debt. You know, China's basically coming in, taking in over their seaports, their shipping yards and things like that.
Yeah. Wow. One of the things that I want us to think about too, you know, so this is how the British approached their foreign policy in Afghanistan. We have a problem with the Taliban, right? Can we learn any lessons? And that's one of the things that I'm not sure about. Can we really learn any lessons? Because the British were dealing with emirs who were mostly concerned about power. The Taliban seems to be mostly religiously motivated. I'm not sure, you know, if let's say we would have gone to the Taliban with half the amount of money that we spent on fighting in Afghanistan, would have that been an influence? You know, could have we convinced them to kick out bin Laden with that? I don't know. What should have we done? You know, for paying them off, you mean? From the taxpayers.
No, absolutely not. Unless you're going to steal it from us.
Yeah. Well, the question becomes, what do you do about, you know, so now in today's world, you can have a terrorist organization that's in the mountains of Afghanistan that's able to strike a target in America. How do we, you know, that was the whole at least supposed reason for us going in there in the first place. How do you deal with that as a
Biblical foreign policy would be protect your borders.
so spend half of that money securing your borders? You're saying, rather than
Yeah, I'm not saying build a wall or anything.
develop something.
How do you do it though? I mean, that's the thing, is it's not like they come in with, you know, these tags and say, I'm here to blow up stuff in your country. And I think that's what makes it, that is why the struggle is real in our day and time, because if you're not going to build a wall, what is the answer? How do you actually, realistically, on a daily basis, try to keep people out who are coming here with the intent purpose of maybe being here for years to acquire the means necessary to strike out at your people? It isn't as easy as just saying, well, hey, when you deal with nations that are next to each other, that's pretty easy. You come in and kill my people, we'll be over this. And that's a defensive war. We're not striking out offensively. We're coming over to handle business because you're attacking, our civilians.
But we've also got terrorist organizations that are no longer state-sponsored. They're harbored, like the Taliban is harboring Al-Qaeda, but again, we've got people that can operate on the other side of the world now. So as Christians, how do we answer, I want to raise these questions. I haven't been able to figure out all the answers, but...
Remember about the way we went into Afghanistan, it was all under the guise of we want to get bin Laden and the people who did this. But we went in and invaded the country. We took over, we essentially became what the British were for so long. And we're still there, propping that government up.
Exactly, we are in a very similar position.
Suspicion holds that we didn't really go in to get bin Laden, but he was the excuse to go and take over the country. It was an excuse to invade. Had we gone in, gotten bin Laden, put the Taliban down, and then left, would we be in the same level of war today that we have been these last...
Well, we might talk about this a little more later, but in the early 90s, well, in the 1990s, in the years leading up to 9/11, the United States had been trying to get bin Laden. We knew he was a threat for at least 5+ years before that, but the frustration was we had nobody there. Like, it's very hard to infiltrate Afghanistan with Westerners. It's very hard to find people there who are even able to be paid off to do these things. So getting him without actually going in a major way was very difficult. But then once we did go in, it took us how many years to find him? And when he did, you don't believe that.
Here's the thing, though, why is he even our enemy in the first place?
Yeah, I look at it.
That's the issue. The only reason that they hate us is because of the way that we've basically tried to bulldoze the world and bully them around into whatever we want.
Well, is it though? I mean, a lot of these people are religiously motivated
against those who are oppressing the states of Sharia law. Like, I would argue that a large part of it has to do exactly with our unbiblical dealings with Israel. The way we've dealt with Israel.
True, a lot of them are mad because of that.
And continue to support them, right or wrong, is why these guys are even our enemies in the first place. They're our enemies because we've already said we don't care what God's word says about foreign policy. We're going to do whatever we think will make us more money. And I think that's why a lot of these guys are our enemy. That's why we were in Vietnam. That's why Korea. It's all border state issues. It's all buffer state issues. And it's all just rejecting biblical mandates.
When you look at where Afghanistan is, though, for the United States to have an Air Force base, to have an army in that position, I mean, you got China, you got the Middle East, you got Russia, you got India, you have every major, superpower right there. Why wouldn't we want to be there?
I think it's a way for us to have some influence on that region. Is the motivation? Is that what you're saying? All right. All righty. Well, we want to definitely continue that discussion as we go forward, though. But thanks everyone for listening, and have a good week.